Venezuela, a country of beautiful coastlines, thick jungles, and proud people. For over 200 years, Venezuela has told the world, and itself, that it is a nation of three bloodlines: Spanish, African, indigenous. Three peoples, blended together, one nation. That's the story in every school textbook. That's the story on every national holiday. But in 2022, when a team of geneticists sat down with thousands of Venezuelan DNA samples and ran them through a full genome analysis, the story fell apart. Here's what they found. Over 93% of Venezuelan maternal DNA, that's the DNA passed from mother to child, untouched for thousands of years, traces back to ancient Native American women. Women who were alive 15,000 years ago, long before Columbus, long before any European ship ever crossed the Atlantic. But the paternal DNA, the father's side, told a completely different story, almost entirely European. Think about what that means. The mothers survived, the fathers were replaced. Scientists have a technical term for this. They call it sex-biased gene flow. History has a darker name for it, and the Venezuelan genome has been carrying this secret quietly for 500 years. Now picture this. A grandmother sitting in a stilt house village on the shores of Lake Maracaibo. The same lake that made a European explorer in 1499 stop his ship and say, "This looks like Venice," and so he named it Venezuela. Little Venice. That grandmother's DNA is 15,000 years old. Her country is 200 years old, and no one has ever told her what lives inside her blood. By the way, where in the world are you watching this from right now? And drop your country in the comments below. And have you ever done a DNA ancestry test? What did it show you? Tell us. The answers are going to be more interesting than you think, because what we just described, that's only the surface. Scientists kept digging. And what they found next? A genetic signal so old and so geographically impossible that researchers thought their equipment was broken. That is where this story really begins. Haplogroup C1b, that is the name of the signal, 4 characters. And when a geneticist in Copenhagen first spotted it in a routine Venezuelan ancestry database scan, she stopped typing. She read the result again, then a third time. A haplogroup is basically a genetic family group, a branch on the human family tree. Haplogroup C1b is a branch of mitochondrial DNA, the kind passed only through mothers, and it had been found before, but always in one specific place, the Caribbean islands, in ancient pre-Arawak populations, people who lived and died on those islands before any known civilization. Finding it in Venezuelan DNA should not have been surprising, except researchers at the University of Puerto Rico traced it backward through ancient samples and found something that flipped the whole story upside down. This lineage didn't go from the Caribbean islands down into South America. It went the other way, from deep inside Venezuela, northward, into the Caribbean, island by island. Venezuela wasn't the edge of the story. Venezuela was the origin. The seeds of an entire ocean's worth of human civilization, the ancestors of the Caribbean's first peoples, started here, in Venezuelan soil. And then they moved north and built a world that the Spanish eventually arrived to destroy. A major study published in the journal PLOS Genetics confirmed this directly. The researchers wrote that the most likely source of indigenous ancestry in Caribbean islanders is a native South American genetic component, shared among inland Amazonian tribes. The tribes who lived on the shores of Lake Maracaibo for thousands of years, the Wayuu, the Añu, the Caquetillos, they had oral traditions about this. They spoke of migration from deep inside the continent. Anthropologists called it mythology. The DNA is calling it a map. Dr. Johannes Krause, one of the world's leading ancient DNA scientists at the Max Planck Institute for the Science of Human History in Germany, said explicitly in 2018, and I quote, "We lacked ancient data from Amazonia, northern South America, and the Caribbean. Filling in these gaps should be a priority." The oral traditions were ahead of science by centuries, but here is where it gets truly strange. Because the deeper researchers pushed into Venezuelan DNA, the further back the story went, and they eventually found a group of people in Venezuela's southern jungle who had been genetically sealed from the rest of the world for over 11,000 years. And when scientists finally broke that seal, what they found inside changed medicine forever. Southern Venezuela, deep in the Amazonas jungle. Venezuelan authorities make first contact with a Yanomami community that had never seen the outside world. No roads, no hospitals, no processed food, no medicine. Nothing from the outside world had ever touched them. Scientists from Mount Sinai Hospital in New York were brought in to study them. They collected samples, gut bacteria, skin bacteria, oral bacteria, and then they ran the analysis. What they found broke every assumption modern medicine had about the human body. Dr. Jose Clemente, senior researcher at the Econ School of Medicine at Mount Sinai, New York, described it this way. These Yanomami had the highest microbiome diversity ever recorded in any human population on Earth. Their gut bacteria were 50% more diverse than the average Americans. Many species that have completely disappeared from modern human bodies were still living inside the Yanomami, healthy and functioning. He called their microbiome humanity's microbial past, a living record of what the human immune system looked like before the modern world destroyed it. But here is the part that stopped researchers cold. Inside the Yanomami gut bacteria, scientists found antibiotic resistance genes, including resistance to synthetic antibiotics, drugs that were invented in laboratories in the 20th century. This community had never touched a single antibiotic in their lives. They had never been near a pharmaceutical drug. They had zero exposure to modern medicine, and yet their bodies were already carrying defenses against drugs that didn't even exist when their ancestors walked into that jungle. So Science magazine reported this in April 2015. The researchers found nearly 60 unique resistance genes in the Yanomami gut bacteria, including genes that protect against synthetic antibiotics that no organism in nature had ever encountered before. How is that possible? The best current explanation is that antibiotic resistance genes existed in nature long before humans invented antibiotics. The Yanomami's isolated bodies had preserved these ancient defenses, while the modern world, by overusing antibiotics, had slowly been destroying the rest of the immune system. The Yanomami weren't primitive. Their bodies were, in some ways, more prepared than ours. But then came the darker chapter of this story. Because not every scientist who came to study the Yanomami came with respect. In the 1990s, researchers from the Human Genome Diversity Project collected blood from Yanomami people without proper consent. No explanation, no permission, no return of results. Those blood samples are still held in laboratories to this day. That scandal forced the United Nations to rewrite the rules of genetic research worldwide. And while that ethical battle was happening in conference rooms on the other side of Venezuela by the lake, something was quietly killing entire families. And nobody was calling it what it was: Lake Maracaibo. 1979. A young American neurologist named Dr. Nancy Wexler gets on a small boat. She travels to a fishing village on the lake's shore. She is there to study Huntington's disease, a fatal brain disorder with no cure. What she finds is something she was not prepared for. Not a few families, not a cluster. But an entire generational crisis. Children watching their parents stumble, parents who can no longer remember their children's names, and at the center of it, a 2-year-old child, with the highest number of CAG genetic repeats ever recorded in a living human being. Dr. Wexler, professor of neuropsychology at Columbia University in New York, kept coming back. She spent 40 years in those villages, and the data her team collected from the Venezuelan families led directly to one of the biggest breakthroughs in medical history. In 1983, using Venezuelan DNA, her team achieved the first ever chromosomal localization of a disease gene using DNA markers alone. For the first time in history, scientists knew exactly where on the human genome a disease lived. Venezuela didn't just produce a genetic tragedy. It produced the foundation of modern medical genetics. Dr. Wexler said it herself, and I quote, "The Venezuelan families have given us many gifts. They helped us find the Huntington's gene in 1983. Now they are critical players in our search for the cure. It is important that the world understand how much they have given." But in 2022, when researchers went back and reanalyzed 443 Venezuelan Huntington's patients, they found something nobody expected. Family members with the exact same CAG repeat number, the marker believed to control when the disease strikes, were getting sick at completely different ages. Same DNA, different timing. Something else inside the Venezuelan genome was silently modifying the disease. Some hidden variable was rewriting the rules. Researchers began searching for the modifier. somewhere the trail led them to an African genetic signal, one that entered the Venezuelan genome under the most violent circumstances in human history. And here is where Venezuela's story goes from sad to something much more complicated. Every Venezuelan history book describes the Atlantic slave trade as one event, one brutal chapter, one wave of people torn from Africa and brought to a new continent. The DNA says that is wrong. When researchers analyzed the African ancestry in Venezuelan genomes, they did not find one African genetic signature. They found two completely separate pulses of migration from Africa, separated in time, traceable to different regions of the African continent, arriving under different colonial operations, decades apart. The first pulse, visible and older, shorter segments of DNA ancestry, traces to coastal West Africa. This matches the earliest years of the slave trade into Venezuela's Caribbean ports. The second pulse, younger, longer segments, connects to West Central Africa, a completely different region, a different wave of deportations under a different colonial structure years later. Think about what this means for real families. A Venezuelan family who identifies simply as Afro-Venezuelan may be carrying two completely separate African origin stories inside their genome. Two nations, two languages, two spiritual worlds, compressed into one cultural identity by 5 centuries of erasure. The genome refuses that compression. It insists on remembering the difference. The Afro-Venezuelan communities of Barlovento, Miranda, and Sucre State on Venezuela's northern coast maintained African-derived drumming ceremonies and healing rituals for centuries. The dominant mestizo culture tried to absorb them, to flatten them into one mixed-race identity. They kept drumming anyway. The DNA now confirms what the drum beats always encoded. These are not one people. They are two ancient peoples, still carrying separate memories in their blood. But then researchers found a third unexpected layer, a European one. The Spanish and Portuguese settlers who came to Venezuela were such a small founding group, so few men, breeding into such a large indigenous and African population, that their European DNA has already genetically diverged from any population still living in Europe today. Modern Spaniards do not carry the same European genetic profile as modern Venezuelans. Thus, the European component in Venezuelan DNA has become something new, and that was 3 layers: indigenous, African, European. But there was a 4th signal, and this one didn't come from the Atlantic world at all. November 2018. A joint research team from Harvard Medical School, the University of California, Santa Cruz, and the Max Planck Institute for the Science of Human History published a study. The title was Reconstructing the Deep Population History of Central and South America. And inside that study was something that overturned a century of archaeological thinking. Dr. David Reich, professor of genetics at Harvard Medical School, one of the most respected ancient DNA scientists in the world, announced the finding directly. He said, and I quote, "We have shown that there was a continent-wide population replacement that began at least 9,000 years ago. Not a slow migration, not cultural mixing, population replacement on a continental scale." His co-lead researcher, Dr. Cosimo Post of the Max Planck Institute in Germany, confirmed what the ancient DNA showed. The Clovis-associated people, the very first humans known to have spread from North America all the way to the southern tip of South America, simply disappeared from the genetic record 9,000 years ago. They reached Patagonia. They lived across the entire continent, and then every single one of their genetic descendants was replaced by a new wave of people. Not one survivor, not one mixed ancestry descendant. Gone. And Venezuela sits right at the geographic center of that replacement zone. See the corridor between the Caribbean, the Andes, and the Amazon, the highway through which every migration wave had to pass. Dr. Reich said explicitly, and this is a direct quote, "We lacked ancient data from Amazonia, northern South America, and the Caribbean. Filling in these gaps should be a priority for future work. That gap is Venezuela. The most important unanswered question in all of American population genetics is Venezuelan. In Venezuela's vast inland plains, the Llanos, indigenous tribes, have oral traditions describing ancestors who came from the direction of the setting sun. Scientists dismissed this for generations as spiritual poetry. given what the genomes are now showing, a Pacific-connected migration signal found in Amazonian populations, that oral tradition looks less like poetry and more like a compass direction. But if Venezuela was the crossroads, if all these migration waves passed through here, then who was already standing there when they arrived? In 2025, scientists found those people, their bones, their DNA, and what was inside those bones. The researchers who published the study described it in their own words as a population with no known living descendants anywhere on Earth. Chekwa, Colombia, 6,000 years ago. A small community of people buries their dead carefully. Arranged positions, deliberate graves. A community that has lived in the highlands of northern South America for longer than any written record exists. In 2025, an international team extracted ancient DNA from their bones, and the human family tree grew a branch and immediately lost it. The results, published in Science Advances, showed that the Chekwa individuals carried a lineage that was genetically unlike any ancient or modern population anywhere in the Americas. They were the descendants of the very first wave that ever entered South America, the original people. And then, by 2,000 years ago, they were gone. The researchers' own words from the published study: the local genetic ancestry is completely replaced, not slowly mixed with new arrivals, not diluted over generations, replaced completely. And here's the part that is impossible to stop thinking about. The Chekwa site is not a battlefield. There are no weapon marks on the bones, no signs of massacre, no evidence of war, just burials. And then, over centuries, new people with completely different DNA. Whatever ended the Chekwa people left no visible mark. That silence is its own kind of horror. Well, the Chekwa people have no living descendants to remember them, no community that carries their name. Their only surviving record is a genome sequence sitting in a university database, and most of the world will never hear that they existed. Now, here is the part that connects back to Venezuela. The 2025 Bogotá Altiplano study, published in Science Advances, found that ceramic-era Venezuelans shared genetic affinities with the replacement population, the Central American wave that completed the Chekwa erasure. Venezuela may have been the origin point of the expansion that wiped out the continent's oldest residents. The crossroads didn't just receive migrations, it sent them. But then researchers asked the next question. If the Chekwa were already ancient 6,000 years ago, who came before them? And the answer to that question is in Venezuela, in the northwestern desert of Falcón State, in a set of bones that are 15,000 years old, bones that have never been opened by science. Falcón State, northwestern Venezuela. Dry riverbeds, cracked clay, bleached desert heat, and buried in the ground, stone tools. Thin, leaf-shaped spearheads, so precisely made that archaeologists named the entire culture after the site where they were first found, the El Jobo culture, at least 13,000 to 15,000 years old. These are the oldest confirmed traces of human life in Venezuela. The people who made those tools hunted mastodons, giant ground sloths, animals that went extinct at the end of the last ice age. These hunters lived through the Pleistocene mass extinction, the death of their entire prey ecosystem. They survived the end of a world, and then they too disappeared from the record. Now here is the most important thing. Despite being Venezuela's oldest known human residents, older than the Chekwa, older than the Yanomami, older than any population genetic study in this entire region, the El Jobo people have never had their DNA sequenced. Not once. No haplogroup has been assigned. No lineage has been traced. They are archaeologically real and genetically invisible. Dr. David Reich of Harvard University said it plainly in 2018. Filling in the gaps in northern South America should be a priority for future work. He said that in 2018. It is now 2026. The gap has not been filled, and the reason comes down to something that has nothing to do with science. Venezuela's decade-long economic collapse has frozen archaeological excavation across Falcón State. While sites are unprotected, the bones are degrading in the heat. International research teams have submitted permits and waited for years. Every year that passes without DNA extraction is a year of genetic evidence gone forever. The oldest chapter of Venezuela's story, possibly the oldest chapter of South American human history, is rotting in the ground while the world looks the other way. But science didn't need to sequence the El Jobo genome to find danger in Venezuelan DNA, because in living Venezuelans, in the maternal line passed from mother to daughter for thousands of years, researchers discovered something that is not ancient history. It is happening right now, in hospitals, in operating rooms, and people are dying from it. January 27, 2026. The American Society of Anesthesiologists and the Society for Pediatric Anesthesia issue a joint emergency communication. The subject is this: severe neurological complications and death after general anesthesia in patients of Venezuelan ancestry. This is not a historical finding. This is not a theory. This is happening now, in hospitals in the United States, in South America, in Europe, wherever Venezuelan patients go under anesthesia. Here is what happened. Doctors began noticing a pattern. Otherwise healthy patients, adults and children, of Venezuelan heritage were undergoing routine surgeries, standard procedures, the kind of surgery people have every day around the world, and some of them were not waking up the same. Brain injuries, seizures, stroke-like damage to the basal ganglia, the deep structures inside the brain that control movement and thought. Some died. Genetic testing was ordered, and what came back shocked the medical community. A point mutation in the ND4 gene, specifically the MTND4 M.11232T to C variant, a tiny error in one mitochondrial gene, maternally inherited, passed from mother to child silently for thousands of years. Doctors Debnath Chatterjee, Phil Morgan, Randall Clark, and Richard Levy, 4 senior physicians in the United States, published their clinical findings in March 2026, explaining exactly what this mutation does. The ND4 gene is a part of complex 1, the engine that produces energy inside every cell of your body. Volatile anesthetics, the gases used to keep patients unconscious during surgery, directly target complex 1. In patients with the ND4 mutation, that interaction doesn't just slow the engine, it switches it off. The brain cells stop producing energy, and brain cells without energy die. The most commonly implicated drug is sevoflurane, one of the most widely used anesthetics in the world. As of early 2026, approximately 40 cases had been identified worldwide, roughly 6 to 8 inside the United States alone. And here is the part that should alarm every doctor and every patient. This mutation leaves no outward signs, no symptoms, no warning in any standard blood test. A person can live their entire life carrying this mutation and feel completely healthy. The only moment it announces itself is when the anesthesia mask is already on your face. The American Society of Anesthesiologists confirmed in their January 2026 statement, and this is a direct quote, "There is currently no available point-of-care screening test for the ND4 mutation. No test, no warning, no way to know in advance. And because the Venezuelan diaspora, driven by one of the largest refugee crises in modern Western Hemisphere history, has spread millions of people of Venezuelan maternal descent across the United States, Spain, Colombia, Chile, and Peru. This mutation is now distributed across multiple continents in people who have no idea it exists inside them. Geneticists tracing the ND4 mutation backward through generations found it converging on a single ancestral woman, one maternal line, tens of thousands of years old. And that line split and branched and survived every catastrophe the ancient world could produce. And now, in the 21st century, it walks into modern hospitals completely undetected. One question remains, and it is the question that will stay with you long after this video ends. Somewhere deep in the timeline of Venezuelan DNA, before the oil rigs, before the Republic, before Columbus, before the Chekwa, before the Clovis hunters walked south through a world full of giant animals, there is a woman. Science cannot name her, cannot date her with full precision, but she is real. She is the mitochondrial root of a lineage that forked, traveled, and survived every catastrophe the last 15,000 years had to offer. Ice ages, mass extinctions, invasions, slavery, disease, political collapse, and then, quietly, tucked invisibly, her DNA began killing her descendants in 21st century operating rooms. When you look at Venezuelan DNA as a whole, you are not looking at a mixed-race nation. You are looking at a record of everything humanity has ever survived. a 15,000-year-old migration corridor that seeded the Caribbean, two separate African worlds compressed into one people by slavery, a European founding population that has already genetically diverged from Spain, a Yanomami time capsule carrying immune complexity that the modern world has permanently lost, a silent mitochondrial mutation spreading through a diaspora of millions, and beneath all of it, the unsequenced bones of the El Jobo people, still waiting in the Falcon Desert. Three enormous mysteries remain. The El Jobo genome has never been sequenced. The force that replaced the Chekwa people, erasing South America's oldest residents without a single visible act of violence, remains genetically unexplained. And the migration corridor through which the very first humans entered South America has never been fully mapped. All three answers are in Venezuela. All three require access to a country that cannot currently protect its own archaeological sites. Every nation tells a story about where it came from. Venezuela's official story is three bloodlines, one nation. The genome tells a different story, one of dozens of migrations, multiple erasures, ghost populations that left no descendants, and a chain of mothers who passed something forward through thousands of years without ever knowing what it meant. What does it mean to belong to a place whose oldest story has never been read? And the bones are still in the ground. The mutation is still spreading. The Chekwa people left no one to mourn them. And somewhere in the dry heat of Falcon State, the answer to one of humanity's oldest questions is sitting in the earth, waiting not for the next scientific discovery, but simply for someone to decide that it matters. Whether that happens before the bones turn to dust, that part science cannot promise. Next time, the genome they found deep in the Amazon that contains a virus no laboratory has ever cataloged. Ancient, sealed inside a tribe for 10,000 years. And now, as the rainforest burns, it is being released into a world with no immunity to it. That story, next.